We're continuing the study of Exodus, and you can see here in chapter 19, it's been 3 months since Israel left Egypt. And they reached the wilderness of Sinai and camp at the foot of Mount Horeb, which is also called Mount Sinai in Scripture. It's interchangeable. And this is the mountain where Moses was first called by God at the burning bush. So just as God said would happen, they would return there. And they did. So they're going to stay there for a total of 11 months, according to what most commentators have pieced together from other passages up through Numbers. And according to research, there's a link in the description called Travel Route. Israel only actually traveled for about 2 years out of the 40, and the other 38 were at Kadesh. There's some good maps at that link. Also, along with the statement that Kadesh was near Petra, which may be the place of safety for the Judeans to run to halfway through the tribulation. You can read about that in Revelation. And both of those places are near the south end of the Dead Sea. And this section is where we first see the phrase, in the Greek text at least, royal priesthood and holy nation. We know this phrase from 1 Peter 2:9. And we remember that the New Testament quotes the Greek rather than the Hebrew, which here in Exodus is translated kingdom of priests and holy nation. So now let's just quickly review the chart that we've seen before on the covenants. And where we are right now is down, you can see where it says that we have the Noah covenant that was for everyone, and then Abraham branched off where there he was selected, then Isaac and Jacob, and then Jacob's 12 sons, and 2 of those will also have more specific covenants. This one with Abraham, of course, is separate and has to do with a unilateral promise, but the covenant with the people of Israel is a conditional covenant, and the 2 principal names of the sons of Jacob were Levi and Judah as far as tribes go. And right now we're getting into this covenant involving Moses. This is the one they're about to basically ratify. So now let's go back to the text here. And we see that this, again, is a conditional promise of God to the house of Jacob and the people of Israel. It's very specific. It's conditional because of the if in verse 5. If you do this, I will do that. And Hebrews 8:6-13 cites the Old Testament as saying that the new covenant would be, quote, with the people of Israel and Judah, unquote. So it's a specific ethnic and religious group that this covenant is with. And the whole purpose of the Jerusalem Council of Acts 15 was to answer the question of whether all Christians had to also be Jews to be part of a covenant. And the answer was no. But that issue of whether the church is the ultimate royal priesthood and holy nation will have to be studied some other time. Just suffice it to say right now that this is where the phrase comes from. It comes mainly from the Greek, although it's very similar in the Hebrew. And this is Greek is what Peter was undoubtedly looking at when he used that phrase. So he didn't just make it up. This wasn't a new teaching is the point. And it was directed, at least originally, to this specific nation of Israel, and the tribe of Judah in particular is where the Messiah would come from. So, but we'll have to put that aside for now and go on here in Exodus. And in this context, long before the church, the nation and people of Israel are the original recipients of this conditional promise. And as Paul later explained, its function was temporary and instructional, and a salvation, so to speak, of works rather than faith. And you can read about that in Galatians 3:12-25. So the contrast is between the unconditional covenant with Abraham and the conditional covenant with Moses and the people of Israel. 2 different things. The blessings can extend to the world, but the covenant is with the nation. And that's the important distinction there. Now we're going to go down to verse 7. Here in chapter 19, and the people verbally agree to the covenant, but Moses goes up to take their answer to God, who then tells him to go back down to the people and tell them to prepare themselves for a more solemn, legally binding ceremony, so to speak, to enact the covenant in writing. So they're supposed to purify themselves, wash their clothes, keep away from the mountain on pain of instant death. They were to be either shot with arrows or stoned or whatever. Even if it was an animal, this had to be done as at least a purification. And they could only approach it after they have heard a trumpet blast from God and a pillar of cloud leaves them. The pillar of cloud has been there, fire by night, of course, and that goes away, and then they hear this trumpet blast and so forth. And they get 2 days to prepare, which Moses adds at this point has to include the couples abstaining from intimacy. Most commentators take this as a matter of subduing the body's cravings of any kind. And in the later laws, the details, we'll see that most uncleanness has to do with some kind of body secretion of any kind. Those are always grounds for uncleanness. So, but what we cannot conclude, as so many have done over the centuries, is that this command is saying that there's something wrong with or unclean with women intrinsically and unworthy to be in God's presence. That's not what it's saying at all. So now let's go down to verse 16, where it says that the time comes for this ceremony or formality to take place, and that people are terrified by the loud trumpet and other loud noises, along with lightning and darkness and so forth, things that they've seen before, but they're really up close and personal, I guess, this time. It could be taken as something like a volcanic eruption by the description, especially down in verse 18. But the cause, once again, is the miraculous presence and power of God. So even if it was just a natural volcano, the timing is not natural, and that this is something that is only begun when God says his presence is there. So this is the first instance where God's loud voice is equated with a trumpet, and the last will be in Revelation 1:10. You can see there that when John is given the revelation on Patmos, that he hears a voice like a trumpet, and he turns around and sees, describing by description that this is the risen Christ. So this trumpet voice is associated with God. This is not to be confused with trumpets of judgment. So, and this is also of God, not of an angel. No angel is blowing this trumpet. So it's just to do with the presence of God. There is a conversation then in the text at this time between God and Moses, and he tells him and Aaron to go up to the mountain, but have everyone else stay at the bottom, at the distance they're supposed to. And that includes the priests, they point out there in the text, though no priesthood has yet been established. But ancient Near East practice was that the heads of families were de facto priests, and we've already met Melchizedek and Jethro as some examples. So the likely reason priests are singled out here is because they may have thought themselves exempt from the command to keep their distance from the holy mountain. So this had to be made clear. There was not a formal priesthood yet, and as just societal priests by choice, that they could not be exempt from this command. So now we're about to read the details of the covenant law, at least the first 10 commandments. But before we do, we have to understand some points as brought out in Constable's notes. There were two common types of covenants. One is called parity, which is between equals, and the other, I don't know how to pronounce, suzerainty, between a sovereign and his subjects. In other words, it's not between equals. Both of them had similar forms. They would begin with a preamble, then a history leading up to the accord of whatever it is, then a statement of principles, and then consequences of either obedience or disobedience. And this one here, of course, is of the suzerainty type, the unequal type, and it had three basic categories: moral life, religious life, and civil life. These are not just religious laws, they're civil laws, they're national laws, and having the moral part is having to do with underlying causes and attitudes. The religious life is more ceremonial, and the civil life would again be national laws. This hardly means that Christians can pick and choose to follow one category or another. or even dissect the Ten Commandments and discard the one that isn't in any way repeated in the New Testament, that being Sabbath laws, so they can say they keep the law without really keeping it. Instead, it simply classifies the applications of the laws, but all the laws were binding on Israel. There weren't some that were binding and others that were not. They were all binding on Israel. So Christians can't pick and choose which ones are still binding just by the made-up rule that if it isn't repeated in the New Testament, then they're off the hook. That's just really bad interpretation, if not bad logic also. So now we'll go to chapter 20. And verses 1 and 2 comprise the preamble part and identify the sovereign and his proven power, this is being God, of course, and how the subjects, the people of Israel, owe him their allegiance. It's an establishment of the inequality of this type of covenant. The first 4 commandments will deal with how the people must relate to God, and the last 6 with how the people relate to each other. Though various groups through history have divided the Ten Commandments in different ways, the numbering used unanimously by the early church was that with which most of us are familiar, that the first is no other gods, the second is no idols. Some combine those two into one commandment, and then because they do that, they still want to come up with 10, they take the commandments about coveting and split them up. So, but the original unanimous practice of the early church was that no other gods and no idols are 2 separate commandments, and the commandment about coveting is 1 commandment. So then verse 3 through 6 are the first 2 actual commandments, and the first one means not that God is to be the chief among many gods, but the only God at all. So monotheism. The second commandment refers to no idols or likenesses of physical or even angelic beings of any kind for the purpose of being venerated as having divine power or ability. In other words, something you would bow down to and give respect to and obeisance to and expect some kind of favors from. It doesn't mean you can't make images of anybody at any time. And we can see here that God says he is a jealous God, so we need to know the difference between jealousy and envy. Jealousy is protecting what is rightfully yours, but envy is desiring what is not rightfully yours. So God being jealous is not bad or immoral as a quality at all, because these are his people. Everybody is his. The whole world is his. So he is jealous. It's because he's guarding what belongs to him. But what about verse 5, which speaks of God avenging sins for up to 4 generations of those who hate him, and mercy to thousands of generations of those who love him and keep his ordinances? And how would we reconcile this with Ezekiel 18, where especially verses 4 and 20 there say that the one who sins is the only one who will die? How do we reconcile those 2 passages? And remember that God says this as part of a formal drawing up of a covenant, not mere poetry or hyperbole, so we can't dismiss it that way. The answer is the difference between guilt and consequences. Here in this passage, God is referring to how those who hate God will invite very long-lasting consequences on their descendants, whereas in Ezekiel, the topic is being held guilty, legally culpable, for what someone else has done. We can all relate to how one simple mistake or sin can affect us or our family, friends, for generations, and some people's mistake can affect a whole nation. And we've seen this for the whole nation of Israel, which of course will reach its extremes when they're exiled, the whole nation of them in the future, and the children born to them in exile certainly weren't at fault. But that's the consequence, not the guilt. And that's how we reconcile those 2 passages. And then the third commandment is about taking the Lord's name in vain. And what that means is to not use it as a casual or vulgar expression, as people do all the time. But again, this is for Israel. And the added warning seems to make this an unforgivable sin, if you look at it, at least under the law, likely because it meant a person is treating God as worthless or shameful. So we should be more careful, though. There's certainly no excuse here for Christians to misuse the name of God or treat it disrespectfully, but I wouldn't take it so far as to say the person will be cut off from salvation if they do that. Certainly there's a problem if you do, and how you deal with that is something that you'll have to study the scriptures and especially the New Testament and see what you want to do about it. But the important thing is the relationship. And in this case, this context with Israel and a conditional covenant, they had to be extra careful about that, or they could be cut off from Israel. So then we go down to verse 8, and it talks about the fourth commandment there, which is about keeping the Sabbath, which was the seventh day of the week from one sundown to the next. Every day was started at sundown, ended at sundown. And so the seventh one of those would begin on sundown Friday, what we call Friday. Whether that's the actual seventh day from when was instituted, I don't think anybody can say for sure. But the reason in the immediate context is to remind them of creation week, as you can see there, which makes no sense if creation took many eons or millions of years, and there's nothing in the Greek or Hebrew to indicate any such thing as a day representing an era or epoch or long period of time or many days or anything like that. There's no hint of it in any context. So the fact that the 7-day week, the seventh day being of rest, based on creation, certainly has a good argument in favor of literal normal Earth days for creation week. And it's interesting also that the Greek text says, remember the day of Sabbaths, plural. The context makes it clear that there's only one Sabbath per 7 per week. So the meaning of the plural here is simply that this is a repeating cycle. In other words, this wasn't going to happen once. This was week after week after week. They would have these Sabbaths. So it's just to point out that it is plural in the Greek. And then down in verse 12, a little bit too far there. It's about the fifth commandment where for children to respect their parents, honor their parents, both father and mother, and not just one, because just as the whole nation owed its life to God, so also the children owed their lives to their parents, both of them, once again. And Paul points out in Ephesians 6:2 that this is the first commandment with a promise. Now, some people would argue that there are actually promises in the other commandments before that, and this is not to say that parents always are sinless and perfect, but that children under their care should show them more honor than they do to other adults or each other or anyone their age or whatever. That there's something, or anyone else's parents actually, they should, there should be a kind of general respect for people who are mature and grown up that help to protect all the kids anyway, in their neighborhood, but especially to the one's parents. And that, I think, is the point there, that it's just not wise to disrespect people that you're dependent on. Children are dependent, they're vulnerable, and anytime you have that kind of dependency, it's just not smart to upset or irritate or disregard the advice of those people. Then the sixth and seventh commandments really stem from the same principle: don't take what doesn't belong to you. Both of them have that in common. The main distinction there between adultery and fornication is that in the latter, fornication, there is no one from whom the other person is being taken. So that's why it's different, except perhaps in a society like this one where, for example, the daughter is considered the property of the father. Now, we don't have that restriction or understanding anymore that no one should be property. That's just against slavery as well. But in that society, that was the case. But so we have to remember the differences in those terms, and it has to do with ownership and allegiance and things like that. So one other point to make about taking what doesn't belong to you and stealing in general is that it requires such a thing as private property. The society God is structuring here is not a commune, but an association of families owning their own properties, livestock, crops, equipment, employees, land ownership within given tribes. They were each given a plot of land in the promised land they would get to eventually. That was especially important to God. And regarding the nation of Israel, every so often we're going to find out that they had to make sure that the land went back to its original owner in a year of Jubilee, because this is really important to God that certain lands were kept for certain tribes. So we can't say that land and geography isn't important to God, and it's especially important in the laws of Moses. But the point is that this is not a commune. This is not everyone sharing all the things equally. This is people owning stuff. And we could actually add the eighth commandment in the same category, since murder is the taking of a life that doesn't belong to you. And critics like to point at this one and say that God violates it since he takes life, but life is his to give or take. And those critics, we all know, would not put themselves under the same rules as they put their own children, thinking that the children should have equal rights just because, it's wrong to impose one's will on another. But again, those children are dependent and vulnerable, and you're obligated to protect them, so they're obligated to listen to you. And this is the same relationship, parent-child, with God and people, especially here in this instance with Israel. He had rescued them, and they owed him something. So instead of the critic's view, this commandment is to keep people from treating life as cheap or theirs to take without divine permission. Now, such permission was granted to society in general when Noah got off the ark, but only if a person took another person's life. It was never granted as a matter of personal vengeance or a way to solve differences. Some even try to take the killing of animals as murder, but the context here and throughout the scriptures never supports such a thing, because they are within our jurisdiction that God delegated even before there was sin in the world. And neither does it grant us the right to maim or torture people or animals and mistreat in any way unless a person has maimed another person. And even then, there is no permission to make the eye for an eye rule an act of torture or to be done slowly. And in the same with animal sacrifices, this is not to be done in a way to cause pain and suffering. It's a way to, the eye for an eye thing is a way to tell people to be careful, basically. If people are fighting, we'll see more about those rules later, but another lesson. But the point is that there are delegated times that God lets society, government, so to speak, do certain things that individuals are forbidden to do, and that's keeping people safe from reckless people or evil people who are intent upon doing harm. That's all that is. That's all it's supposed to be, at least ideally. And then from the issue of not murdering comes the question about suicide too, because if we belong to God, then we can't even take our own lives because they don't belong to us. So it would be a form of stealing. On the other hand, we can't be cold. We should show compassion, since many suicides are the result of immaturity or just somebody having a bad day and no support, or somebody suffering a lot, or they have a mental illness. There could be a bunch of reasons. So we need to let God be the judge of their eternal soul. But at the same time, we should be more intent upon keeping watch over each other and looking for signs of that and show some concern so that we prevent it instead of having to deal with the aftermath. Now, the ninth commandment, which is about bearing false witness, is specifically about false accusations, not all statements of untruth. After all, God himself used cover stories in various times in Israel's history, and he will send a quote-unquote strong delusion during the future tribulation against people who have hated the truth and delighted in unrighteousness. So, but this is hardly a blanket endorsement of lying. That's not what I'm saying. Even if you think about it, politeness and diplomacy are often borderline or outright lies, but they can prevent hostility or needless tension, or sometimes even more. And the important thing is the intent. Are we trying to harm or help? I think that's the key. Slander is always harmful. That's what false witness is. It's slandering because its purpose is to ruin someone's life or reputation for something they never did. So it's lying with bad intent. And, of course, it should go without saying, but doesn't anymore, that just because you're offended or you don't like somebody is not justification for slandering them, but people do it anyway. Now, the 10th and final commandment is against envy. Remember the difference between that and jealousy. And it is not simply a matter of wanting something. There's nothing wrong with wanting something, but having the desire to take it through, though the owner is not offering it for sale or to trade or to give to you, you want it anyway. And you know you can't have it, but you want it. That's envy. In fact, all the commandments prohibit taking what is rightfully someone else's, whether the other person is a person, people, or God, or whether it's an object or someone's honor or God's honor. The whole principle of all these 10 commandments is don't take what doesn't belong to you and give what you owe. I think you could sum all the 10 commandments up with that. So now let's go to verse 18. And after all of this, all the commandments, the 10 are given. There are actually 613, but these are the main 10. And after all this, the terrified Israelites asked Moses to speak to God for them in the future, but Moses explains that this fear of God is part of the instruction. They were supposed to fear him. This is God, and they're not. So in saying this, though, they have asked for intermediaries between themselves and God, that is to say, a priesthood. Critics take this as an indictment against God, who in their judgment is immoral for wanting to be feared. But again, we appeal to them as parents. Do they not expect their children to fear punishment should they defy them? Ideally, parents give rules to protect and guide, so defiance can be dangerous or deadly. And if the children don't learn by words, then they'll have to learn by actions. If you do this with compassion and love, that's the way it's supposed to be done. Of course, parents aren't perfect either, and they misuse their power. That doesn't mean parents shouldn't discipline children. And the children who are raised in a healthy discipline home, rarely you will find them faulting their parents, but respecting them instead. And this is what God has repeatedly demonstrated. He's reluctant to punish, but always has as his goal the maturity and reconciliation of the people, who he is actually bringing up like children. And this is what Paul will say in the New Testament about the purpose of the law, being, as I mentioned before, about Galatians 3, where he says the law was like a schoolmaster or a custodian whose job, the custodian in that society, especially among the Greeks, was to see to a child's upbringing and education and training until they were mature and could inherit the estate. So that's the reason for that, the business about fearing God. And then we go down to verse 24. And God instructs them to make, if they're going to make altars for sacrifice, they should be made out of dirt, or they can be made out of stone, but only if the stones are uncut. And the reason is that the tools would defile them in some way. So there's always a reason, as I've said many times before, for God's rules. And they're also not supposed to build the altars so high that you have to go up on steps and somebody could see under the robes of the priests. And these requirements were both likely counter arguments to the worship practices of other religions. So that's a lot of that is coming from the fact that they were in Egypt all that time, after all, and they had encountered other religions along the way. And so they had to be careful not to copy those practices. So that's it for the 10 Commandments. And we'll start in the next lesson on chapter 21, which will start to flesh out the more day-to-day details of what all that implies.